Tonight, John Swinney from the SNP.
We've all got a big decision to make about who leads the UK for the next 5 years, about who has power and influence in Westminster. You get the opportunity to have your say in the election on July the 4th. On Monday, we heard from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking to other party leaders. Tonight, we're in Edinburgh with the leader of the Scottish National Party, First Minister John Swinney. First Minister, welcome.
Thank you.
My promise at the start of this interview is that what you say in the next half hour will be broadcast in full. I want you to have the chance to make your case to people. I simply ask that you do your best to answer the questions. And just to confirm, you've not been told what the questions are. They are new to you.
They are all new to me. I don't know the questions and I look forward to answering them.
Well, let's begin with you. 7 weeks ago, you thought you'd retired from frontline politics. You probably thought you were going to be relaxing, putting your feet up, watching Germany play in the Euros, Scotland play Germany in the Euros. And then the SNP leader quits. You become First Minister, you become party leader, and now this.
Well, life has been rather turned on its head, Nick, to say the least. I didn't expect to be in the situation I'm in today, but it's a tremendous honour to do that, to be the First Minister of my country. It's the greatest honour I could ever have in life, and also to lead my party. And I didn't quite expect that we'd be thrown into a general election campaign quite as quickly, but it gives me the opportunity to engage very directly with the electorate in Scotland and across the United Kingdom and to explain who I am.
Now, you say you've been listening to the electorate in Scotland. You will know what they've been saying. They say time for a change. 70% in a recent poll said they wanted a fresh team of leaders. Doesn't that mean a change from you? A change from the SNP, not just a change from the Conservatives in Westminster?
I think what the people are saying is that they're concerned about the issues that affect their lives, about the cost of living, about the challenges in our public services, about the implications of Brexit, for example. And I think people are hurting just now. I think it's been a really difficult period for people. And what I want to do is to directly address the concerns that people have and to work as hard as I can to lead a government that addresses the core concerns of people in Scotland, and also that makes sure that the interests of Scotland are well protected as a consequence of this election.
You see, you, the SNP, you've been in power for 17 years. You first came to office before the iPhone was invented. You've been in power for almost all that time. I want to show you a photo. There we are. You, Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond. You are the three musketeers of the SNP. Do you accept that their record is John Swinney's record, that their successes, their failures are John Swinney's?
Of course, I am part and parcel of the SNP. I've been part and parcel of the SNP for over 40 years, and it's been my privilege to be in government. I've had what I didn't quite think was going to be a sabbatical year, but it's turned out to be a sabbatical year, and I'm now back in office as First Minister of Scotland. But I'm crucially wanting to build on the record of the SNP government, because I think the record of the SNP government is a strong record where, for example, we have transformed the availability of early learning and childcare in Scotland, where since we came to office, that's doubled. So for families in Scotland, they're saving over £5,500 a year because the SNP government has put in place 1,140 hours of early learning and childcare, the best proposition in the whole of the United Kingdom.
So we're going to come to your record in a second in government, but we should start where you start. When this general election, let's remember, for Westminster was called, you said July the 4th, election day, is Independence Day. You've promised that, though you haven't published your manifesto yet, you said line 1, page 1, will be independence. What does that mean? What does this Westminster election mean for the move for Scottish independence?
Well, what we're saying is that if people vote for the Scottish National Party and we win a majority of seats in this election, that will trigger a process of negotiation with the United Kingdom government to bring about Scottish independence and to enable people to have that choice.
So Nicola Sturgeon was right, was she, when she said, if you get a majority, if people, in other words, vote in SNP in the numbers you want, that's it, no more referendums, you're empowered to have negotiations straight away with the government in Westminster for Scotland to leave the UK.
Well, what our position is that if we win a majority of seats, there will then be a process of negotiation with the United Kingdom government to give what we set out, and will set out in our manifesto, democratic effect to the rights of the people of Scotland to be independent. So in my view...
No second referendum.
I'm just coming to that. My view is that that should involve Scotland having a referendum, because I accept that the choice of Scotland becoming an independent country is a choice of great significance for the people of Scotland.
So you've changed approach from Nicola Sturgeon. She said no need for a second referendum. Your party conference motion here, I've got it, says the Scottish Government would be empowered in that situation to begin immediate negotiations with the UK Government. You're saying no?
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. Immediate negotiations to bring about Scottish independence so that we can have the ability of the people of Scotland to decide their own constitutional future. And for me, that's a fundamentally democratic point.
Just so people, forgive me interrupting, I just want to be clear, second referendum or not, if you get a majority of seats?
Well, I think the best way to bring about Scottish independence is for there to be an open democratic referendum as we had in 2014. Okay. And everybody accepts that's the best way to go about this. And
but if you don't get it, you go ahead.
Well, what I'm saying is that we've got to give democratic effect to the wishes of the people of Scotland, and that's what our manifesto will call for.
Okay. You also said at the beginning of this campaign, you said the election was about ABC. And I want to go through your ABC. Yep. Your first A was austerity. Now, you have used a number again and again and again in the Scottish leaders' debate last night, accusing other parties of bringing about austerity. Before we come to that, do you accept that independence, line 1, page 1 of your manifesto, independence would itself lead to austerity?
No, I don't accept that. I accept that an independent Scotland would have to operate sustainable public finances. I think anyone that looks at my track record, I was 10 years the Finance Minister of Scotland, and I ran a balanced budget. I knew how to control money, I knew how to raise revenue, I knew how to make sure that we lived within our means. So I accept that an independent Scotland would have to exercise financial stability and fiscal sustainability. So all of those considerations have to be part of the discussion about independence, but it's an obligation of government to make sure that's done properly. And of course, part of what we're wrestling with today is the fact that the United Kingdom government of Liz Truss spectacularly didn't do that and caused the type of increase in mortgages that people are wrestling with in Scotland today.
But you see, you keep quoting independent experts as saying Westminster will bring about austerity. Whoever's elected, that's what you've been telling Scottish voters. Those independent experts are from something called the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and they wrote this. It's highly likely that an independent Scotland would need to make bigger cuts to public spending or bigger increases to taxes in the first decade following independence, bigger than the rest of the UK.
What the Institute for Fiscal Studies say in all of their analysis about Scotland's finances, they look at Scotland's finances within the United Kingdom, but they also accept, and I think it's important to accept this, that as an independent country we would have much more flexibility and manoeuvrability as a country to improve our economic performance. Scotland's already improving our economic performance. If you go over the years since 2007, GDP per capita in Scotland has increased at a faster rate than the rest of the United Kingdom. The productivity gap between Scotland and the rest of the UK has substantially, if not entirely, been closed over that period. So that's an indication of how we can improve economic performance even within the United Kingdom. But what an independent country allows us to do, and if you look at other small European independent countries, they've got a stronger economic performance than the UK, and Scotland would be in a position to emulate that.
Now, I'm going to make you an offer. You're no longer First Minister, I'm going to make you Prime Minister. You keep waving around this warning of £18 billion of cut. I make you Prime Minister now. No, you can't be, of course. But I'm going to make you Prime Minister. What do? Do you cut spending? Do you increase taxes? Because that's what you've done in Scotland, isn't it? You've cut spending so much that in SNP-run Glasgow, teachers are being laid off. You've increased taxes so much that, according to the taxman, the HMRC, 1,000 higher earners have left Scotland, haven't stayed here, because taxes are much higher here than they are in the rest of the UK?
Well, there's lots of points to this, so this might be a long answer, Nick. First thing is that more people have come to Scotland to pay tax than have left Scotland. So that's the first point. We've got a net increase in taxpayers coming into Scotland, despite the fact that you correctly say we've increased taxes on higher earners. The second point is that we have to live within a fiscal envelope that's largely determined by the UK government. So we get a block grant from the UK, and we can supplement it by changing tax, which we have done, and as I've said already, we've increased taxes on higher earners. That's given us £1.5 billion more to invest in public services in Scotland.
And still there are cuts in Glasgow.
Well, that's because
SNP austerity.
Well, that's because of the austerity that we're living with from the UK government. Now, that brings me.
What is SNP austerity?
No.
You've frozen council tax. You are not allowing councils in Scotland to increase their council tax. That's the SNP government. The SNP-run council then lays off teachers. That's SNP cuts, SNP austerity.
But what we do with the council tax freeze is that we fully fund that. We give the City of Glasgow Council, as we give every council in the country, the money to compensate for the revenue they've lost by freezing the council tax. Now, to come back to your very first question, what would I do as Prime Minister? Well, what I'd do as Prime Minister to avoid the £18 billion worth of cuts is that I would replicate the tax changes that we've made in Scotland in the rest of the UK. And that would essentially address the £18 billion fiscal gap.
That's what you're voting for if you vote SNP, taxes up.
Well, people know in Scotland that the SNP has increased taxes on higher earners. So
some teachers, some policemen, not the millionaires, not the business owners, ordinary people.
Well, for people who are teachers or police officers, the difference in tax is very limited. But of course, there are other benefits, like the fact that people in Scotland don't pay for university tuition, or that they don't pay for prescriptions, or that they have generally a council tax payment that's about £500, £600 lower than if they were living in England. So there are different considerations to be borne in mind rather than just focusing on the tax issue. But I'm not in any way seeking to downplay the significance of increasing tax for higher earners. Because what that's done
if you have power in Westminster,
that's allowed us to invest in our public services.
Forgive me. It means if you have power in Westminster, not as Prime Minister, but it's possible that the SNP may have crucial votes in Westminster. What you're saying is you would vote to persuade the government in Westminster to put people's taxes up. Even people on relatively modest earnings would have their taxes go up because that's what the SNP believe in.
The alternative to that, of course, is cuts in public spending. And if there's a choice to be made of the cuts in public spending that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are essentially signed up to, and that's the point the Institute for Fiscal Studies have made, that Labour are not being open with people about the fact that they've signed up to £18 billion worth of cuts because the Conservatives have already signed up to them. I'm saying the answer to that...
They deny it, as you know, but let's talk about...
But they can't deny that, Nick. That's part of the point I've been making in this election campaign. Labour are ducking and diving on the fact that there's a next generation of spending cuts that are going to come from Labour.
Let's talk about ducking and diving. Let's talk about openness then. Because one of the things that Westminster does, of course, there are many things that you have power over as the leader of the Scottish Government, as the First Minister of Scotland, but you don't have power over everything, which is why you want independence. But one of the things that Westminster still has power over is the decision about whether to develop new oil and gas fields. That is a decision for Westminster. But SNP MPs sent to Westminster would have a vote on that. So really simple question. Do SNP MPs vote to approve new oil and gas fields, protecting jobs in Scotland? You keep saying up to 100,000 jobs are dependent on that industry here. Or do you vote against and keep the oil and gas in the ground?
It essentially depends on the impact of any of such development on our move to net zero. So what we've said is that all licences and all applications need to be considered on a case-by-case basis based on their compatibility with our objectives on climate. So there will be that test is absolutely vital to be undertaken to determine whether any new development can be compatible with the necessary journey to net zero that we must make as a society.
I don't think people watching knows what that means. You see, they knew with your predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, when it came to opening a huge new oil field, Rosebank, said it was the greatest act of environmental vandalism in my lifetime. When you were in coalition with the Greens, we knew it was no more oil and gas. Now there's an election, it's all a bit hazy, isn't it? It's all about we're not sure, we don't say yes, we don't say no.
Well, I think the consistent point in all of those different statements you've put to me is the necessity of undertaking the assessment as to whether the development is compatible with our objectives on net zero. We've got a climate emergency. None of us can duck that. I can't duck that, and I'm not prepared to duck it. But I've also got to manage a transition for the oil and gas sector that enables that sector to establish fiscal sustainability, and also to then be able to contribute towards the journey to renewable energy, which is a very significant opportunity in Scotland, particularly in the field of offshore wind.
I think you're saying so some new oil and gas,
well, what I'm,
possibly,
well, what I'm saying,
in certain
well, what I'm saying is that every particular development has got to be tested against its climate implications.
Sure.
Now, what I can't say here...
So forgive me, but people who are passionate about climate change say you don't need an assessment, it's obvious. It stays in the ground. Oil and gas stays in the ground. And that's what Nicola Sturgeon used to say. It's what the Greens say in Scotland, and you seem to now be wobbling on it.
Well, what I'm saying is that there has to be an assessment to determine whether or not that any licence application is compatible with our net zero obligations. Now, the Prime Minister has basically said he will licence 100 new projects. I think that is utterly irresponsible. That is climate denier status of the first order. So we've got to have a rational, considered process to look at every application to determine whether it can be sustained and compatible with our climate objectives.
You know what that means, though? It means uncertainty for people who are prepared to invest not $1 million or $2 million, not $100 million or $2 million. There are people watching your interview who've got billions of pounds to invest in Scotland, and they hear you unable to say yes or no. They hear uncertainty. They hear people playing politics with 100,000 jobs in oil and gas. And won't they think, we'll keep our money where we like, we won't invest in Scotland?
I think what they'll hear is a rational process from a rational government, which says we've got an obligation to get to net zero. We've got to tackle the climate emergency, and we've got to make our contribution to that. And the oil and gas sector accept that. They accept that journey's got to be made. What they're looking for is a government that will work with them to make sure that they can manage that transition. I've lived in Scotland all my life, and I saw the hopes and the livelihoods of my peers blighted by the industrial devastation of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And I will not do that to the oil and gas sector in the north east of Scotland.
We're going to move on, First Minister, because we've got a lot to get through. ABC, I mentioned that you talked about. We talked about one of them, austerity, Brexit and cost of living. We may come to later. I want to go to D. You didn't list D, but I'm going to give you a D. D is for delivery. Who runs, just for clarity, for viewers, not just in Scotland, but around the UK, who runs the National Health Service in Scotland? Who determines its budget? Who makes the decisions about the NHS in Scotland?
The Scottish Government that I have the privilege to lead.
And last night you were told by a woman at the Scottish Leaders' Debate about her 93-year-old mother who'd waited 6 hours for an ambulance and 2 hours outside the hospital. And someone shouted at you in that debate at one point, you always say it's someone else's fault. You ought to be held to account, are you? You in the SNP, it's your government, your health service, you run it.
Of course, and if I give my complete answer to the point last night, I apologise to that lady because her mum should not have had that experience, and I reiterate that apology just now, because I am conscious that there are people who are not getting the service that they should get, despite the commitment of the NHS staff and personnel, the length and breadth of the country. Now, we have a National Health Service which the government is giving the record sums of money to support. The Health Service, when I became Finance Secretary 17 years ago, the Health Service accounted for about 33% of the Scottish Government's budget. It is now in excess of 40% of the Scottish Government's budget. So, as a proportion of our budget, where we've had the ability to take those decisions, the Health Service is occupying a much greater part of our budget. But I accept, despite all that money, despite the fact we've got record staffing levels, demand is so high on the Health Service, were not able to deliver the service that that lady that put that to me raised with me last night.
You've
and
been
I'm
open,
sorry
you've
for
been
that.
honest about the problems. Will you be open and honest about the fact that you made promises? Your predecessor as First Minister was Health Minister, Humza Yousaf. He said he would, and I quote, eradicate long waiting lists in the NHS. Yet here in Scotland, 7,000 still waiting more than 2 years for treatment, 37,000 waiting over a year. You have not delivered on the NHS, have you?
We're making headway on the long waits, but I accept there are still people waiting too long. There are other measures which show the comparative performance of the health service in Scotland. So if you take A&E waiting times, for example, Scotland has, in core sites, the best performing A&E system in the United Kingdom, better than England, better than Wales, and we've had that
And
status.
still the worst ever in the history of Scotland.
Well, that's in a
worst
sense.
ever.
In a sense, my point is this: that we have an A&E system that is performing the best in the United Kingdom, and we have done so for the best part of 10 years. But there are still challenges that exist within the National Health Service,
But you see,
despite the fact that we've substantially
you
funded
run
the
the NHS
system.
in Scotland. You have all the power. You tax more than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. You spend more on the NHS per patient than they do in England and Wales. And yet still, you've got 37,000 people waiting more than a year.
And I think that's a measure of the scale of demand there is for the National Health Service, and we've got to honestly confront that. That's why we're leading debates in the Scottish Parliament about the reform that's necessary to make sure that we have much more emphasis on prevention, so that we're supporting people to live lives more substantially within the community and not require hospital intervention, so that that can get us into a situation where we reduce the demand that is presenting on the National Health Service.
Now, one other delivery point, schools. Why have they gone backwards under the SNP? You'll know there's an internationally recognised way of comparing the way schools perform on maths and reading and science. There's no complicated statistics in this. You're sliding down the tables. And you, Mr Swinney, you were responsible for Scottish schools for 6 years. You were the minister for it.
Well, there's a variety of data that you can look at. You know, for example, National 5, which is our central qualification in Scotland, there was a record level of National 5 passes achieved by pupils in Scotland in 2023. If you look at the outcomes that young people are achieving from education, we've got a record number of young people leaving school in Scotland and going into university, college, training or work as a consequence of their education.
It's an international measure. It's not disputed. Nobody says, oh, there's a better way of measuring. This is the international measure. Scotland schools are going down and England schools are going up.
It's one of the measures, and what I'm saying to you is that there's a variety of measures that can be looked at, and the outcomes that have been achieved in Scottish schools are resulting in the highest number of young people, the greatest proportion of young people, going on to positive destinations as a consequence.
I said D was for delivery. I'm going to give you another D. D is for distraction. D is for division. You spent in the Scottish Government, when you were at the heart of it, an enormous amount of time in a way that divided your nation, discussing how people change their gender rather than delivering. If there is a Labour government, will you pursue that? Will you still try to change the way in which men and women can change their gender?
I think the key point here is that the Scottish Parliament decided these issues. It wasn't the Scottish Government, it wasn't the SNP on its own. The Scottish Parliament, with support from the SNP, Green, Liberal Democrat, Labour and Conservative members, voted for the legislation that was passed.
It's a simple question. Do you pursue it with a different government in Westminster, or do you drop it?
Well, clearly, we're unable to pursue it because
if there's a new government,
that would be up to that UK government to determine are they going to change their stance. But as things stand just now, I can't pursue it because the law makes it clear I can't do that.
I want to know if you've changed your stance. You see, after the row about a rapist called Adam, sent to a woman's prison after he changed gender whilst waiting to stand trial and asked that he be called Isla, have you, John Swinney, changed your attitude on this controversial topic?
Well, I think, there's 2 points I'd make there. The first is that we've got to be absolutely focused on making sure that we protect the rights of women and girls as we wrestle with all of these issues. And these are legitimate and real issues. We've got to protect the rights of women and girls. We've got to protect single-sex spaces. And the Equalities Act, of course, enables us to do so. The second point is that we've got to understand that there are great challenges that face the transgender community within our society. I don't want to do what others have done, which is to turn a minority or try to turn a minority into an enemy. I want to bring people together.
I think you haven't changed your mind on it, but you've had the chance to say if you have. Let's go to what the core issue for you is, the politics of this general election. Remember, voting for Westminster, you hardly need reminding of that. There's a simple point that many people make. If, as many Scots do, they want the Tories out of Downing Street, out of government in Westminster, it's very simple. You vote for the only party that can replace them in power in Westminster, the Labour Party. You vote for Keir Starmer's party.
I don't think it's as simple as that at all. I think what's happening is that the Conservatives have completely and utterly lost it in England. It's very clear that England is going to vote to oust the Conservatives. So in Scotland, we've got to think very carefully about what we do. And the point I've been making throughout this election campaign is that an incoming Labour government has committed itself to carry on with Tory austerity, with £18 billion worth of cuts that they've signed up to. And people need to understand that.
They haven't said that, to be clear.
Well, they've signed.
You think it'll happen, but they haven't said it.
They've signed up to it. Yeah. They've accepted the starting point. That's the key point. And what I'm saying is that people in Scotland need to understand the folk who will always stand on their side, who will always defend the interests of Scotland, will be SNP members of Parliament. And that's why people should vote SNP in this election.
There are dozens of seats in Scotland that could make a difference to who is the next Prime Minister of this country. Are you really saying that you think there is no difference between having Keir Starmer in Downing Street and the Labour Party or having Rishi Sunak? You're willing to take that risk?
Well, I don't think there's any risk involved because England is going to vote against the Conservatives. It's plain, it's absolutely clear.
You spent 20 years telling people they've got to have independence because England always votes for the Tories.
Listen, England's going to vote against the Tories. It's absolutely crystal clear. So people in Scotland have got to decide who's going to protect them at Westminster, and the SNP will do it.
Let me ask you one final question, John Swinney. After 17 years in power in Scotland, after 9 years as the biggest party in Westminster in Scotland, 3 leaders in 2 years, 1 questioned by the police, the other resigned having lost the confidence of Holyrood, failures to deliver in the NHS and in schools, what you yourself have called a housing emergency in Scotland. Does the SNP really deserve the votes of Scots?
The SNP's had a tough time in the last few years. I'm the first to accept that. That's why I'm here. And I'm here to sort it out and to strengthen the SNP and to build the trust with the electorate. And that's exactly what I'm doing.
John Swinney, First Minister, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks for watching.